I am Valerie, 35 years old, and still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. You know, Valerie, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I disabled every family credit account and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. Inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary and prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's, joined honor societies, and poured every ounce of my energy into proving I was worthy of a seat at their table. It was never enough. My sister Monique was the undeniable golden child. A former college beauty queen who married Connor, a wealthy white real estate broker, she represented everything my parents valued: status and appearances. My cybersecurity career was entirely dismissed. To them, I was just an awkward girl. That disrespect culminated 5 years ago on a freezing Christmas evening that permanently severed our ties. I had closed my first federal contract, bringing my net worth into the 8-figure range. Wanting to share my success, I spent thousands on presents: a Rolex for my father, a diamond bracelet for my mother, and Paris tickets for Monique and Connor. I loaded the wrapped boxes into my car and drove through a blinding snowstorm to Fairfield. The driveway was packed with unrecognized luxury vehicles. Snow crunched under my boots as I hauled the heavy bags up the front steps. I reached for the brass handle, expecting the door to be unlocked. It was firmly bolted. I pressed the doorbell, shivering in the wind. I peered through the large bay window. The living room was ablaze with warmth. My father, Calvin, was pouring expensive whiskey. Monique laughed loudly, clinging to Connor's arm. Sitting on plush leather sofas were Connor's parents, dressed in cashmere, sharing a joyous celebration. They had flown in from Aspen. My family was hosting an extravagant holiday dinner with my white brother-in-law's wealthy relatives, and I had not been invited. I knocked on the heavy door harder this time. Finally, the porch light flicked on. The door cracked open exactly 1 inch, the security chain remaining firmly secured. My mother Brenda peered out, her expression instantly souring. She pulled her silk shawl tighter against the freezing air. "What are you doing here, Valerie?" Her voice was sharp, laced with genuine annoyance rather than surprise. "It is Christmas Day, Mom. I brought gifts for everyone. I have some amazing news about my company to share." Brenda let out an exaggerated sigh. Her eyes darted toward the living room, terrified her prestigious guests might notice her undesirable daughter. "We did not think you would actually come. You are always busy with those boring spreadsheets. Connor's parents flew in from Aspen yesterday, and there is simply no room at the table for you tonight." I stood frozen, not from the winter air, but from her absolute callousness. My own mother was turning me away on Christmas because my presence would ruin her perfect aesthetic for her son-in-law's family. "Mom." I drove an hour in a blizzard. I am freezing. I have thousands of dollars in gifts right here. "Just leave the boxes on the porch, Valerie." Brenda dismissed my plea effortlessly. "I will bring them inside later. You should go home before the roads get worse. We can catch up next week." She started to close the door. I did not beg or cry. Years of seeking validation from a family that actively despised me suddenly evaporated, replaced by a cold and calculating clarity. "Wait," I said, my voice dangerously calm. Brenda paused. Her brow furrowed in irritation. "What is it now?" "Nothing," I replied, staring directly into her cold eyes. "Enjoy your perfect family." I dropped the bags into a deep snowdrift beside the welcome mat. The expensive wrapping paper immediately soaked up the wet snow. I turned my back on the sprawling colonial house and got into my car, blasting the heat. Driving away from Fairfield, I vowed I would never allow those people to make me feel small again. I buried myself in my work securing massive government contracts. My wealth multiplied invisibly far away from their toxic judgment. 5 years passed without a single phone call, holiday card, or text message. I erased them from my life, and they happily forgot I existed. Fast forward to this morning. I sat in the glass-walled conference room of a prestigious law firm in Buckhead, Atlanta. The Georgia sun streamed through the windows as my real estate attorney slid a massive stack of closing documents across the mahogany table. I picked up my pen and signed the final line, officially taking ownership of a $4.5 million mansion in the state's most exclusive neighborhood. I paid for the entire estate in cash. The lawyer shook my hand, handing me a set of heavy brass keys. "Congratulations, Miss Jefferson. The property is completely yours." I smiled, feeling a profound sense of triumph. I had built an empire from nothing, proving every insult my family hurled at me wrong. I walked out of the office, breathing in the sweet southern air, ready to start the next chapter of my peaceful, independent life. Then my phone buzzed in my purse. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. My heart hardened. It was a text message, the first communication in half a decade. It was from my mother. I stared at the glowing letters, reading the impossible words she had just sent me, and I knew instantly that my peace was over. The golden child had failed, their money was gone, and the vultures had finally smelled my success. I swiped away the notification and tossed my phone onto the marble kitchen island. I refused to let Brenda steal my joy on the very day I closed on my dream home. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked out to the veranda, and looked over my lush 4-acre property in the heart of Buckhead. I had earned every single blade of grass out there through brutal 80-hour weeks designing encrypted security systems for government agencies. For 2 blissful days, I ignored the flashing screen of my phone. I busied myself with unpacking, directing the interior decorators, and setting up my secure home office server. I actually started to believe that silence was my permanent new reality. That naive illusion shattered on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was deep into coding a firewall patch when the heavy chime of my front gate intercom echoed through the empty halls of my mansion. I frowned, setting my coffee mug down. I was not expecting any deliveries, and my property was tucked far back into a private gated community. I pulled up the high-definition security feed on my second monitor, and my blood instantly ran cold. Blocking my wrought iron driveway gates was an enormous moving truck, and standing right in front of the camera lens demanding entry was the nightmare I had walked away from 5 years ago. My father, Calvin, wearing his Sunday church suit, was violently jabbing his finger into the call button. Beside him stood my mother, Brenda, clutching a designer handbag that looked entirely out of place next to the moving truck. A few steps behind them, leaning against his luxury vehicle with an unmistakable look of arrogant entitlement, was Connor. And clinging to his arm, rubbing a very obvious pregnant belly, was my sister Monique. They had not just found me. They had packed up their entire lives and driven straight to my doorstep without so much as a warning. My hand hovered over the intercom button. Part of me wanted to call the local police immediately and report trespassers. But the tactical side of my brain, the side that made me a top-tier cybersecurity consultant, knew I needed to hear their angle first. I pressed the microphone icon. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice echoing flat and distorted through the outdoor speaker system. Brenda flinched at the sound, but Calvin immediately stepped right up to the camera lens. "Valerie," he barked, his booming voice carrying the exact same commanding tone he used when preaching from the pulpit. "Open these gates right now. It is freezing out here and your sister needs to use the restroom." I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, watching them on the high-resolution screen. "You are trespassing, Calvin. I do not have visitors today." "Stop playing games with us," Brenda snapped, pushing her way into the camera frame. "We saw the public property records online. Do not think you can hide from your own flesh and blood. You bought this estate in cash. 8 bedrooms, Valerie. 8. You are living in a palace while your own sister is out on the street. Open the gate so the movers can get the truck up the driveway." The sheer audacity of her demand left me speechless for a fraction of a second. They brought a moving truck to a house they had never been invited to, expecting to just move right in. "Nobody is coming up my driveway," I replied, tapping my fingers against my desk. "Why exactly is my sister on the street?" I thought Connor was the star real estate broker of Atlanta. I thought he was providing that perfect life you always compared me to. Monique suddenly pushed past our parents, her face blotchy and red. Her designer maternity dress was wrinkled, and she looked nothing like the smug, golden child from 5 years ago. "Connor lost his business," she yelled at the camera, her voice thick with tears. "The market shifted and we got foreclosed on. Mom and Dad sold their house and drained their retirement fund to help us pay off his business debts. We have nothing left, Valerie. We lost the country club membership, we lost the cars, and we lost the house. You owe us this. You have more than enough room for all of us." I stared at the screen, letting her words sink in. My parents had bankrupted themselves to save their golden child and her white husband. They had literally sold the roof over their own heads to cover his financial failures. And now that they had bled themselves dry, they expected to turn my hard-earned sanctuary into their personal lifeboat. "You made your choices," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady calm. "5 years ago, you locked me out in a blizzard on Christmas Day. You told me there was no room at your table. Now you want me to hand over the keys to a multi-million-dollar estate I bought with my own money. The answer is absolutely not. Turn that truck around and leave." Calvin slammed his fist against the stone pillar holding the intercom. "A good Christian daughter does not leave her pregnant sister on the street," he roared, his face turning purple with rage. "We are your parents. We gave you life. We are commanding you to honor your mother and father and let your family inside. The church will hear about how you hoard your wealth while your own blood suffers." "You can tell the congregation whatever you want," I replied, unmoved by his religious guilt-tripping. "But you are not crossing my property line." That is when Connor stepped forward. He gently nudged Calvin aside and looked directly into the camera lens. He casually adjusted the cuffs of his expensive tailored jacket, a smug, predatory smile spreading across his face. He did not look like a man who had just lost everything. He looked like a man who thought he still held all the cards. He always believed his status made him untouchable, and he was about to try and use that against me. "You are a number cruncher, Valerie," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You sit behind a computer screen all day playing with code. But you do not know how real estate works in this state, and you certainly do not understand how things operate in this specific zip code." I watched his arrogant blue eyes on my monitor, feeling my jaw clench. He was standing outside my property, completely bankrupt, yet still trying to talk down to me. "You see," Connor continued, leaning closer to the intercom, "I know the people who sit on the board of this community association. They are my golf buddies. This neighborhood has very strict bylaws about who gets approved to live here. I highly doubt they thoroughly vetted your background. Open the gate right now, or I will make one phone call. I will have the Homeowners Association launch a full investigation into how a single Black woman managed to buy a cash property in their elite neighborhood. We will have your minority status and your business finances tied up in audits and legal red tape so fast it will make your head spin. We are moving in, Valerie. You can either open the gate or I will have you dragged out by the board." I did not flinch at Connor's threat. I simply pushed my chair back from the monitors, grabbed the keys to my car, and walked out to the garage. If Connor wanted to throw his weight around, he was going to do it while looking me dead in the eye. I slid into the driver's seat and drove down the long, winding driveway, the tires crunching softly against the pristine gravel. Through the windshield, I saw them huddled together in the humid Georgia heat, looking exactly like the scavengers they were. I parked a few yards away from the towering iron gates and stepped out. I kept the heavy iron bars firmly between us, a physical boundary they would never be allowed to cross. Connor immediately gripped the iron bars, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He was a tall man who consistently used his physical height to dominate every room he entered, and he clearly expected me to shrink back in fear. Instead, I stood my ground, crossing my arms over my chest. He pressed his face close to the dark metal, his breath fogging the humid air between us. "Listen to me very carefully, Valerie," he spoke in that slow, measured tone people use when trying to pacify someone they consider hopelessly beneath them. "You are entirely out of your depth here. You might have gotten lucky with a few government tech contracts, but this is Buckhead. This is real estate. It is a completely different game, and it is a game I have mastered. You do not have the pedigree or the financial literacy to maintain an estate like this. The annual property taxes, the groundskeeping, the relentless social expectations of the homeowners association. You are going to fail, and when you do, it will be a spectacular public embarrassment." I stared at him, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from his pores. He was completely broke, standing outside my gates like a vagrant, and yet he was actively attempting to gaslight me into believing I was the incompetent one. "Let your family handle this burden," Connor continued, his voice dripping with false concern. "Sign the property management rights over to my brokerage. We can move into the main house and properly maintain the estate's value. You can take one of the guest suites out back so you can focus on your little coding projects. It is the only logical solution to protect your investment." Before I could even formulate a response to his outrageous demand, Monique wedged herself next to her husband. She rested her hands dramatically on her pregnant stomach, glaring at me through the iron bars. "You should be on your knees thanking him for the offer?" Monique sneered, her voice laced with the exact same venom she used when we were teenagers. Connor's family took a temporary financial hit because the market was manipulated against him. But he is a brilliant businessman, and he is bouncing back quickly. He is a top-tier broker. He should not have to suffer in some cramped, cheap apartment while he rebuilds his portfolio. It is entirely degrading to a man of his stature. I looked past my sister to my parents, who were standing silently behind them, nodding in vigorous agreement. "Degrading." I repeated, my voice eerily calm against the background noise of the idling moving truck. "But it is not degrading to show up uninvited and beg your estranged sister for a place to sleep." "We are absolutely not begging," Brenda snapped, stepping forward and pointing an accusing finger at me. "We are telling you what is going to happen. Your father and I already gave Monique and Connor our entire retirement fund. We sold the colonial house in Fairfield and liquidated every asset we had to cover the remaining debts of his firm. We sacrificed everything to make sure this family maintains its proper standing in society. We did our part, Valerie. Now it is time for you to do yours. You owe us this space. You owe your pregnant sister a safe luxury home to raise her baby." The puzzle pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. My parents had bankrupted their entire lives for the golden child. They had handed over their life savings, their financial security, and their beloved home to a man who had squandered every single penny. Now left with absolutely nothing but their misplaced pride, they expected me to absorb the devastating consequences of their blind favoritism. "You sold your own home to pay for his massive failures," I said, looking directly at my father, whose face was currently flushing red. "And now you expect me to hand over my home to fix the mess you created. That is not how family works. That is how a parasite operates." I pulled my phone from my pocket and held the screen up high so they could all see it clearly. I already dialed 911 and paused right before hitting the call button. "You have exactly 60 seconds to get that massive truck out of my driveway before I call the Atlanta police and have every single one of you arrested for criminal trespassing," I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet neighborhood. "I will press maximum charges, and I will make absolutely sure the arrest records are entirely public. Let us see exactly how quickly Connor bounces back when his potential high-end clients see his mugshot plastered online." Calvin's face contorted with unhinged fury. He raised his heavy hand as if he wanted to strike the gate, but Brenda quickly grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with sudden panic. She knew I was not bluffing. She knew the daughter standing before her was no longer the desperate girl seeking their approval. "Come on!" Calvin Brenda muttered, pulling him firmly toward the moving truck. "We will not stand here and be humiliated by an ungrateful, selfish child. We will find another way to handle this situation." Monique glared at me, her eyes full of intense hatred, before turning heavily to follow our parents back to the vehicles. But Connor did not move immediately. He lingered at the iron bars, watching his ruined family retreat to the truck. Once they were safely out of earshot, he leaned his face tight against the cold, dark metal. The arrogant smirk returned to his lips, colder and far more calculating than before. "You really think you won today?" Valerie Connor whispered, his voice barely carrying over the loud rumble of the truck engine. "But you are just a clueless tech girl playing out of your league. I know the complex zoning laws in this county. I know the obscure legal loopholes that someone like you would never even think to look for. Enjoy sleeping in your massive empty house tonight. Because by next week, this entire property will legally be mine, and I will have the absolute pleasure of throwing your belongings onto the street and evicting you myself." I watched Connor turn his back and walk down my driveway with the unearned swagger of a man who still thought he ruled the world. I did not shake. I did not panic. I simply locked the gate from my phone and walked back inside my beautiful, empty house. The next morning, I drove my Porsche into the private underground parking garage of the downtown Atlanta forensic accounting firm, where I was a senior partner. Connor calling me a clueless tech girl was the most hilarious miscalculation he could have possibly made. I did not just play with code, I was a certified financial investigator. I spent my days tracking offshore accounts, exposing corporate embezzlement, and dismantling the digital webs of white-collar criminals. Connor was a local real estate broker who wore flashy suits. I tore down billionaires for a living. I walked into my corner office overlooking the city skyline and set my briefcase on the glass desk. My assistant handed me a fresh coffee and a stack of morning briefs, but before I could even sit down, my private cell phone began to ring. I checked the screen. It was Pastor Miller from the church my family had attended for over 2 decades. My father served as a senior deacon there, holding immense power over the congregation. I answered the call, expecting a standard request for the annual charity drive. Instead, I was met with a heavy, disappointed sigh. "Valerie, Pastor Miller," said his voice thick with sorrow. "I have been praying for you all morning. I am calling to ask if you need spiritual counseling or an intervention before the police get involved." I froze, my hand hovering over my keyboard. I asked him what on earth he was talking about. "Do not play coy with me, Valerie," he replied sternly. "Your father took the pulpit during the Wednesday night service. Calvin stood before the entire congregation and wept. He broke down in tears at the altar. He told us everything. He said you manipulated your parents into signing over Monique's inheritance. He told the church that you are involved in a massive money laundering scheme and that you used those dirty funds to buy a mansion in Buckhead. He said you are committing elder abuse by leaving them bankrupt and homeless while you live in sin and luxury." My stomach plummeted. The sheer scale of the lie was breathtaking. Calvin was using his sacred position as a deacon to completely destroy my reputation in the community I grew up in. "Pastor Miller," I said, keeping my tone completely even despite the rage boiling in my veins. "My father voluntarily liquidated his own assets to pay off my brother-in-law's massive business debts. I bought my home with the money I earned from federal accounting contracts. Every single dime is public record." The pastor sighed again, clearly not believing a word I said. "Your mother," Brenda corroborated everything, Valerie. "She stood up there and cried, saying she did not know where she went wrong raising you. She said you laughed in her face when she begged for a place to sleep. The deacon board is having an emergency meeting tonight to discuss formally excommunicating you from the church. We cannot have our members associating with someone committing elder abuse and financial crimes. I urge you to repent and turn your house over to your parents to make amends." I hung up the phone without saying another word. A smear campaign, that was their next move. They knew they had no legal right to my home, so they were trying to completely isolate me, to destroy my social standing, and pressure me into surrendering. My parents were willing to portray me as a criminal just to provide a soft landing pad for Monique and Connor. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the Atlanta skyline. They wanted to play dirty. They wanted to drag my name through the mud. I opened my specialized accounting software and began pulling up public records on Connor's real estate firm. If they wanted a war over finances, they had just picked a fight with a four-star general. Before I could even dive into Connor's tax filings, my office phone buzzed. It was the firm's head of human resources asking me to come down to her office immediately. I walked down the glass hallway, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. When I entered the HR suite, I found not only the director, but also our firm's chief compliance officer sitting at the large round table. Their faces were grim. "Take a seat," Valerie, the HR director, said, sliding a thick manila folder toward me. "We have a very serious situation on our hands. This morning, our corporate ethics hotline received 3 anonymous complaints regarding your conduct." I looked down at the folder but did not open it. Complaints about what exactly? The compliance officer cleared his throat, looking incredibly uncomfortable. "The complaints allege that you are actively committing corporate embezzlement. They claim you have been siphoning funds from our government clients and hiding the money in shell companies to purchase luxury real estate. Given the nature of our firm, we are required to take any allegations of financial crimes extremely seriously. We are going to have to suspend your access to the company servers, pending a full internal investigation." A cold, calculating smile slowly spread across my face. Connor. He had actually done it. He had followed through on his threat to sabotage my career, hoping to cut off my income and force me out of my new mansion. But Connor was arrogant, and arrogance always leads to sloppy mistakes. "You do not need to suspend my server access," I said, leaning forward and tapping the manila folder. "I am a senior forensic accountant. Do you honestly think I would be stupid enough to embezzle money from federal clients?" The HR director frowned. "We have to follow protocol, Valerie. The complaints are highly detailed." "I am sure they are," I replied calmly. "But whoever filed these anonymous tips clearly does not understand how digital footprints work. I want you to pull up the raw data logs from the ethics hotline right now." The compliance officer hesitated but opened his laptop. "What exactly am I looking for?" "Look at the IP addresses attached to the submission forms," I instructed. "Whoever submitted those complaints had to route them through an internet service provider. Check the origin of the digital headers." The room fell completely silent as the compliance officer typed rapidly. I watched his eyes widen as the data populated on his screen. "Well," I asked, crossing my arms, "where did the anonymous complaints come from?" The compliance officer looked up, his face pale with shock. "They all came from the exact same IP address. It is registered to a commercial office building in Midtown, a real estate brokerage firm owned by a man named Connor." I stood up from my chair, smoothing down my skirt. "That is my brother-in-law," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "He is currently facing massive financial ruin, and he is trying to blackmail me into giving him my home. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a job to do. I am going to tear his entire financial life apart." I barely had time to process the sheer stupidity of Connor using his own commercial IP address to file fake federal ethics complaints against me when my personal cell phone lit up on my desk. It was a text from my mother, Brenda. The message claimed she and my father wanted to meet me at a neutral location to apologize for the scene at my gate and talk things out like a real family. I stared at the glowing screen, my pulse steady and cool. I knew my mother. Brenda did not apologize. She did not negotiate. She only sent messages like that when she believed she had a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. I replied with a single word, agreeing to meet them at an upscale cafe in the center of Buckhead. It was a highly public space filled with working professionals and security cameras. If they were planning an ambush, I was going to make sure there were plenty of witnesses. I packed up my briefcase, grabbing a hidden digital voice recorder from my desk drawer. In the world of forensic accounting, documentation was the only currency that mattered. I slipped the recorder into my jacket pocket, hit record, and walked out of my office building ready to face the firing squad. The cafe was bustling with the midday lunch crowd when I arrived. The air smelled of roasted espresso beans and expensive pastries. I spotted them immediately sitting in a leather booth near the back corner. Calvin was wearing his deacon lapel pin, puffing his chest out in a show of forced authority. Brenda sat beside him, her posture stiff and unyielding. Monique was squeezed into the opposite side of the booth, aggressively stirring a decaf latte. Connor was noticeably absent, clearly too much of a coward to face me directly after sending his fraudulent complaints. I approached the table and slid into the empty seat across from my parents. I did not order a drink. I simply folded my hands on the marble tabletop and waited. The fake pleasantries lasted exactly 3 seconds before the mask completely slipped off Brenda's face. She reached into her oversized designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She slammed it down onto the marble table with a sharp crack that caused the businessman sitting at the next table to flinch. Calvin immediately placed his heavy hand on top of the envelope, sliding it directly in front of me. "We are done playing games with you, Valerie," my father said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You have disrespected this family for the last time. Connor is a generous man. He is willing to overlook the absolute disgrace of how you treated your pregnant sister this morning, but only if you do exactly what we say right now." I looked down at the envelope and then back up at the three of them. I asked them what exactly Connor thought he was offering me. Monique leaned across the table, her eyes wide with manic triumph. She tapped her long acrylic nail against the thick paper. "He is offering you a way to stay out of federal prison, Valerie. Open it." I broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out a small stack of legal documents. I recognized the formatting immediately. It was a quitclaim deed prepared for the state of Georgia. The paperwork was drafted to legally transfer 50% of the ownership of my new $4.5 million mansion directly into Connor's name. It effectively made him a co-owner of the estate I had just purchased with cash, giving him full legal authority to move his family in and dictate what happened to the property. "Sign the quitclaim deed," Valerie, Brenda hissed, leaning so close I could smell the bitter coffee on her breath. "You transfer half of that house to Connor today. If you do not sign those papers right now, Connor's lawyer is going to take all that proof of your little corporate embezzlement scheme and hand-deliver it straight to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." I kept my expression completely blank, letting her dig the hole deeper. "You thought you were so smart," Calvin added, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "You thought you could lock us out of that massive house and flaunt your dirty money. Connor did some digging into your firm, Valerie. He knows exactly how you afford a lifestyle like that. He has documented proof that you are siphoning federal funds. If you do not sign this deed, he will expose you. You will be stripped of your accounting license. You will face federal indictment, and you will lose that mansion anyway when the government seizes your assets." Monique crossed her arms, looking entirely too pleased with herself. "Connor's family might have lost some money, but he is bouncing back quickly. He is a brilliant man, Valerie. He should not have to suffer in a cheap apartment while he gets his firm back on its feet. Mom and Dad already gave us their entire retirement fund to help keep us afloat. You owe us this space. You owe us half of that house to make up for what we lost." They were actually blackmailing me. They were using the fabricated ethics complaints Connor had filed from his own office IP address as leverage to extort multi-million-dollar real estate from me. They had no idea I had already traced the digital footprint right back to his desk. They thought I was trapped, terrified of an FBI investigation that had absolutely zero basis in reality. I looked down at the quitclaim deed in my hands. As a senior forensic accountant, I spent my entire career analyzing complex financial and legal documents. I audited multi-billion-dollar corporate mergers. I spotted irregularities in offshore shell companies blindfolded. So when I scanned the paperwork Connor had hastily drafted to steal my home, I almost burst out laughing right there in the cafe. Connor was a real estate broker, but he was a lazy and desperate one. He had clearly downloaded a generic out-of-state quitclaim template from a cheap legal website. He had completely failed to include the mandatory jurisdictional clauses required by Georgia property law. Worse, he had attached a notary seal block that referenced a county we did not even reside in. But the most glaring amateurish mistake of all was the intimidation letter attached to the back of the deed. It explicitly laid out the threat of reporting me to the authorities if I did not sign the property over. They had literally put their extortion demand in writing. I did not panic. I did not yell. I simply smiled, a cold, sharp smile that made the color drain completely out of Monique's face. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the camera application and held the phone high above the table. The camera shutter clicked loudly as I took crystal-clear, high-definition photos of the fraudulent deed, the attached extortion letter, and their signatures at the bottom of the demand. Brenda gasped, lunging across the table to grab my phone, but I was faster. I slipped the device safely back into my jacket pocket, where my voice recorder was still silently capturing every single word. "What are you doing?" Calvin demanded, his voice rising in panic. "We told you to sign it." I slowly stood up from the booth, looking down at the three people who had traded their own daughter for a con artist. "You really should have hired a better lawyer," I said, my voice ringing out clearly over the cafe chatter. Connor used a generic template that is not even legally binding in this state. And more importantly, you just handed a senior forensic accountant documented written proof of attempted extortion and blackmail. You tied your demands directly to the false federal complaints Connor filed from his own office this morning. Monique stared at me, her jaw dropping in absolute horror, as she realized her husband's grand master plan was crumbling to pieces. "Tell Connor to pack a bag," I said, looking right at my sister. "See you in court." I turned my back on my family and walked out the glass doors of the cafe, stepping into the bright Atlanta sunlight, leaving them completely speechless in the booth. I left the coffee shop and marched straight to my car. The bright Atlanta sunlight felt like a spotlight illuminating the pathetic reality of my family. They had actually believed I would cower in the face of a fabricated legal document. They thought they could bully a senior forensic accountant into signing away a multi-million-dollar estate. I got behind the wheel of my Porsche, tossed my phone onto the passenger seat, and drove directly back to my firm. The adrenaline was still pumping through my veins, but my mind was completely clear and focused on one singular objective. It was time to completely dismantle Connor. I walked back into my corner office and immediately summoned my top junior analyst, Marcus. He was a brilliant numbers guy who could trace a hidden offshore account faster than anyone I knew. Marcus stepped into my office carrying his laptop, taking one look at my face and immediately sitting down at the glass desk. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told Marcus to pull up every single public financial record, state business filing, and property tax history connected to my brother-in-law and his real estate brokerage. We started with the basics. Connor had claimed his business went under because of a sudden market shift, but as Marcus and I began cross-referencing the public deeds and corporate registry filings, the math simply did not add up. A standard market downturn causes a reduction in revenue and perhaps some foreclosures on over-leveraged properties. It does not cause an entire portfolio of cash-rich investments to vanish into thin air in a matter of months. "Look at this," Marcus said, rotating his laptop screen toward me. He pointed to a complex web of limited liability companies all registered to Connor's business address. He was operating a real estate syndication fund. He pooled money from private investors to buy commercial properties. I leaned in closer, scanning the digital spreadsheets. "That is a perfectly legal business model," I noted. "What is the anomaly?" "The anomaly is the actual property acquisitions," Marcus replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard to pull up county tax records. "Look at the capital he raised versus the assets he actually purchased. In the last 3 years, Connor brought in over $8 million from private investors. But according to the county registry, his firm only purchased 2 properties, a rundown strip mall and a vacant lot in the suburbs. Both were bought for less than $1 million combined." My eyes narrowed as I stared at the glaring discrepancy on the screen. Where did the other $7 million go? Marcus brought up a public bankruptcy filing from one of Connor's shell companies. He was issuing massive quarterly dividend payments to his early investors, returns of 12 to 15%. But those properties were not generating any rental income. The strip mall was completely empty, and the lot was undeveloped dirt. The realization hit me like a physical blow. A cold chill washed over my arms as I understood exactly what I was looking at. Connor was not a brilliant real estate broker who fell on hard times. He was a criminal. He was paying the massive quarterly dividends to his early investors using the principal capital he raised from his new investors. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme. He had created an illusion of massive success to lure in more money while bleeding the entire fund dry to fund his own luxury lifestyle. And when the flow of new investors finally dried up, the entire house of cards had completely collapsed. I asked Marcus to pull the names of the investors listed in the public bankruptcy filings. As the list populated on the large monitor on my wall, my blood ran ice cold. Every single name on that list was familiar to me. They were the members of the deacon board from my father's church. They were the elderly widows, the wealthy congregants, and the retired business owners who sat in the front pews every Sunday. My father, Calvin, had not just given Connor his retirement fund. He had actively used his position of absolute trust and authority within the church to feed innocent congregants directly into Connor's fraudulent scheme. Calvin had vouched for him. He had convinced his own flock to hand over their life savings to a con artist. And now that the money was completely gone, Calvin was facing the total destruction of his reputation and possible criminal liability for his involvement. That was exactly why he had wept at the altar and lied about me. He was desperate to create a distraction and find a scapegoat before the congregation realized he had helped rob them blind. But the horror did not stop there. Marcus continued diving into the uniform commercial code filings and public lien records associated with Connor's name. Valerie Marcus said, his voice dropping to a hushed whisper, "You need to see this right now." I walked around the desk and looked over his shoulder. Marcus had uncovered a massive outstanding lien against Connor personally. It was not a loan from a traditional bank or a standard mortgage lender. It was a debt registered to a shadow entity, an aggressive private equity firm known for functioning as high-level loan sharks. They lent money to desperate developers who could not get traditional financing, but their terms were absolutely brutal. Connor was $2 million in debt to this shadow lender. I read through the public terms of the loan, and the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. Connor had taken out a high-interest bridge loan to try and keep his Ponzi scheme afloat just a little bit longer. But the lender had attached a strict balloon payment clause. The entire $2 million principal was due in full by Christmas week. If Connor did not pay the debt, the private lender would not just take him to court. They would completely destroy him. They would seize whatever meager assets he had left, garnish his future wages forever, and refer the fraudulent loan application to federal prosecutors. "He needs collateral," I whispered, staring at the screen in absolute shock. "Exactly," Marcus agreed. "He needs a high-value, unencumbered asset to secure a new loan and pay off these guys before the deadline." He needed my house. That was why they had driven a moving truck to my gate. That was why they had ambushed me with a fraudulent quitclaim deed and threatened me with a fake embezzlement scandal. Connor was backed into a corner by dangerous people, and he was facing imminent federal prison time. He was literally fighting for his life, and he had convinced my parents to help him steal my $4.5 million estate to save his own skin. He needed my name on that deed by next week, or his entire world was going to violently end. I stood perfectly still in my office, listening to the quiet hum of the servers. My family had sold their souls to protect a criminal, and they were perfectly willing to destroy my entire life to cover up his crimes. But they had severely underestimated me. I reached into my pocket and touched the digital voice recorder, feeling the cold metal against my fingertips. I had all the leverage now, and I was going to use every single ounce of it. I packed my laptop and the printed financial logs into my leather briefcase, leaving the quiet hum of my firm behind. The drive back to Buckhead was usually my time to decompress and let the high-stakes pressure of forensic accounting melt away. Tonight, however, my mind was operating at maximum capacity. I had the digital voice recorder burning a hole in my pocket and a mountain of evidence proving my brother-in-law was running a fraudulent Ponzi scheme. Connor was backed into a corner by a dangerous private equity firm, and he was running out of time to pay off a $2 million shadow debt. He was a desperate animal caught in a trap of his own making, and desperate animals were incredibly predictable. The sun was just beginning to dip below the tree line as I turned onto my private road. The dense canopy of ancient oaks cast long shadows across the pristine gravel driveway. I pressed the button on my visor remote, expecting the massive wrought iron gates to swing open. Instead, the heavy metal doors remained perfectly still. I frowned, tapping the button a second time. The security system was hardwired and completely foolproof. As my car idled in the driveway, I squinted through the twilight and noticed something white fluttering against the dark iron bars. I put the car in park and stepped out into the crisp evening air. Taped directly over the electronic sensor of my gate was a thick piece of heavy legal paper. It had been secured with thick strips of industrial tape, clearly meant to leave a message. I walked up to the gate and ripped the paper down. It was stamped with a very official-looking red seal at the top. I stood in the glow of my headlights and read the bold black lettering. It was a formal notice of eviction. I scanned the paragraphs of legal jargon, feeling a cold laugh bubbling up in my chest. The document asserted that I was merely a month-to-month tenant occupying the estate, and that Connor was the rightful landlord and primary property manager. It claimed I had defaulted on rent and was in violation of a fictitious lease agreement. The sheer audacity was staggering. Connor had actually filed a fraudulent claim with the County Housing Authority, using forged property management credentials to establish a fake paper trail. He was trying to create a documented history of control over my house to show his shadow lenders that he had collateral to secure his $2 million debt. I folded the ridiculous document and shoved it into my pocket. I manually triggered the gate override from my phone and drove up to the main house. The sheer silence of the mansion was usually comforting, but tonight it felt like the calm before a storm. I walked into my kitchen and dropped my keys on the marble island. The red notification light on my home phone system was blinking rapidly in the dark. I pressed the speaker button and the booming voice of my father echoed through the empty kitchen. "We warned you." Valerie Calvin began, his tone dripping with righteous fury and absolute authority. "You thought you could disrespect this family and hoard your dirty money, but you are entirely out of your depth. Connor is a highly respected broker, and he knows judges in this county. He knows exactly how the system works, and he has already filed the paperwork to take control of that property. Pack your things. We are moving in on Christmas Eve, and we are bringing the local police to escort you out of that house if you resist. Do not make this harder than it has to be, Valerie. You brought this upon yourself by turning your back on your own blood." The voicemail clicked off, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Christmas Eve. I stood perfectly still, staring at the blinking red light. 5 years ago on Christmas Eve, they had locked me out of their home in a freezing blizzard because I dared to question Connor's golden boy status. Now they were using that exact same date to try and rip my sanctuary away from me. They thought the threat of police and judges would terrify me into submission. They truly believed that because they held power in their little church congregation, they could manipulate the federal legal system with absolute impunity. I walked into my home office and began emptying my briefcase onto the large mahogany desk. I was not just a disgruntled sister fighting over family drama. I was a senior forensic accountant who tore down corrupt corporations for a living. I laid out the printed IP logs, proving Connor filed false corporate embezzlement complaints against me. I set down the high-resolution photographs of the amateurish quit-claim deed they had tried to force me to sign at the coffee shop. I arranged the bankruptcy filings, the shell company records, and the proof of his $2 million shadow debt. Finally, I placed the fraudulent eviction notice and the digital recording of my father's extortion threat right in the center of the desk. Connor needed my house by Christmas to save himself from going to prison or worse. He was building a fake legal narrative to steal my property, and my parents were actively assisting him in a massive wire fraud and real estate conspiracy. They were going to show up on my doorstep on Christmas Eve, expecting me to surrender. I reached for my cell phone and scrolled through my encrypted contacts until I found the direct number I needed. I bypassed the receptionist and waited as the secure line rang twice. Agent Miller, a gruff voice answered on the other end. I took a deep breath, looking down at the undeniable mountain of federal evidence scattered across my desk. Agent Miller and I had worked together on several high-profile corporate takedowns over the last 4 years. He was an FBI agent who specialized entirely in real estate wire fraud and financial extortion. Agent Miller. I said, my voice steady and cold with absolute certainty. I have a massive case for you, and the perpetrators are about to hand-deliver the evidence. Agent Miller listened intently as I provided a rapid-fire summary of the forged deed, the extortion letter, and the fake eviction notice taped to my front gate. He did not interrupt me once. When I finally finished, he let out a low whistle of disbelief. He confirmed that Connor had crossed the line from a local civil dispute straight into federal wire fraud and criminal extortion. But Agent Miller needed them to take one final step. He needed them to act on their threats and physically execute their fraudulent takeover of the property across state lines. If they stepped foot inside my house intending to claim it as their own, using forged federal documents, the trap would snap shut permanently. I told him I knew exactly how to roll out the red carpet for them. I ended the call with the FBI and stared at the dark screen of my smartphone. For my entire life, my mother Brenda had operated under the absolute delusion that she was the smartest person in any room. She thrived on dominance and control. She viewed my independence not as an achievement, but as a direct insult to her authority. To catch her, I had to give her the one thing she craved more than money or status. I had to give her my complete submission. I needed to feed her ego until she was so bloated with artificial triumph that she became entirely blind to the reality around her. I closed my eyes and took a slow, deep breath. I forced my heart rate to slow down. I pictured the scared little girl I used to be whenever Calvin raised his voice. I let that old, buried fear rise into my throat, making my voice tight and shaky. I dialed my parents' landline. Brenda answered on the first ring. Her tone was sharp and defensive, clearly expecting me to yell about the eviction notice they had left at my gate. She was braced for a war. I did not give her one. Instead, I let out a ragged, trembling breath. I asked her why she was doing this to me. My voice cracked perfectly on the last syllable. I heard a sudden shift in the background noise and knew she had put me on speakerphone. She wanted Calvin and Monique to hear my defeat. They were all sitting in their living room, eagerly waiting to feast on my misery. I launched into the performance of a lifetime. I told them I was terrified. I rambled about how I had looked up Connor online and saw how connected he was in the local real estate market. I cried, telling them I could not afford to fight a connected broker in a rigged county court system. I sobbed into the receiver, claiming the stress was going to cost me my accounting license and send me to prison. I fed them every single insecurity they had ever projected onto me. I told them they had broken me. "You win, Mom," I cried falsely, making sure my breath hitched loudly enough for the microphone to pick up. "I cannot afford a legal battle. I will leave the house on the 23rd. You can have it for Christmas." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with their collective shock. It was followed immediately by the intoxicating sound of Brenda gloating. She did not offer a single ounce of maternal comfort. She did not hesitate or show a fraction of remorse. She simply reveled in her absolute victory over her own child. Her voice dripped with poisonous satisfaction as she delivered her final judgment. "I told you a black woman could not hold on to a house like that without a smart man like Connor guiding her." Brenda sneered. Her words were dripping with decades of internalized misogyny and blatant racism. "You thought your little calculators and spreadsheets made you better than us. You were arrogant, Valerie. You are lucky Connor is a generous man and is willing to let you walk away without sending you to federal prison. Pack your cheap clothes and get out. Leave the keys under the mat." Calvin chimed in from the background, his voice booming with fake righteousness. "Do not try to take any of the appliances or fixtures, Valerie. That house belongs to Connor now. If anything is missing, we will have you arrested for theft. We will be there first thing on Christmas Eve to claim what is rightfully ours." I whimpered a final, pathetic apology and pressed the end call button. The second the line went dead, the trembling completely stopped. The fake tears instantly dried. My posture straightened, and a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. I had handed them the rope, and they had eagerly tied it around their own necks. They actually believed I was fleeing into the night like a terrified child. They were going to march up to my front door on Christmas Eve, expecting an empty Concord mansion. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and turned around to survey my living room. I was not alone. The house was not being packed up in moving boxes. Instead, my massive open-concept living area was bustling with a highly specialized crew of federal technicians. Agent Miller had worked incredibly fast. After reviewing the digital evidence I sent him, he had immediately dispatched a technical surveillance team to my property. 3 men in dark polo shirts were currently standing on tall ladders near my vaulted ceilings. They were seamlessly installing hidden 4K resolution cameras directly into the custom crown molding. Another technician was carefully wiring high-fidelity microphones inside the massive crystal chandelier above my dining table. They were outfitting the kitchen, the entryway, the primary hallways, and my home office with state-of-the-art surveillance equipment. Every single camera was angled perfectly to capture the front door and the main living spaces. They were wiring the entire $4.5 million estate to broadcast straight to an FBI command center. I stood in the center of the room watching the trap being expertly laid. My family wanted my house for Christmas. I was going to make absolutely certain they received an unforgettable holiday welcome. I watched the senior technician adjust a microscopic camera lens hidden perfectly inside the ornate crown molding above my fireplace when my cell phone vibrated violently against my palm. I looked down at the glowing screen and saw Connor's name flashing on the caller identification. I did not answer the phone. I knew better than to engage in an unrecorded voice conversation with a hostile party. A second later, a text message chimed through. He simply could not resist. Brenda must have called him the exact second we hung up the phone to deliver the glorious news of my total mental collapse. Connor was drunk on the illusion of his impending victory, and his monumental ego desperately demanded an audience. The first message was a simple, pathetic taunt. "I told your father you did not have the stomach for a real fight, Valerie," he wrote. "Smart move backing down and giving us the house." I stared at the text message, feeling a cold wave of absolute satisfaction wash over me. In the world of forensic accounting, we have a saying about white-collar criminals. The smartest ones never get caught, but the arrogant ones always catch themselves. Connor fell perfectly into the latter category. He was a desperate man who needed to feel powerful and superior. I decided to give him exactly what he wanted. I typed out a reply, making sure my digital tone matched the pathetic surrender I had just performed for my mother. "I just do not understand how you did it," I wrote, adding a simple question mark to sell my bewilderment. "I checked the county registry this morning. It usually takes weeks to process a commercial deed transfer. You did it in 3 days." I hit send and watched the 3 gray dots of the typing bubble appear almost instantly. Connor took the bait exactly as I anticipated. He could not stand the thought of me simply surrendering without knowing exactly how brilliant and cunning he was. His response was a massive multi-paragraph essay of pure self-incrimination. "You really think you are the only one who understands the system, Valerie," he typed. "I still have my platinum broker credentials. I have direct back-end access to the county registry portal. I bypassed the standard public filing system and uploaded the quitclaim deed straight into the priority queue. I flagged it as an emergency administrative transfer. It bypassed the clerk review entirely." So, I read the words twice, making sure I was not hallucinating. He had just admitted in writing to misusing his professional real estate license to commit digital fraud on a secured government server. He was actively logging his federal crimes into an unencrypted text thread just to brag to his sister-in-law. But I needed the final piece of the puzzle. I needed the kill shot. A forged signature is one thing, but a notarized forged signature is a completely different level of felony. It elevated the crime from a simple civil dispute to an organized criminal conspiracy involving a state-appointed official. I typed out my next message, my thumbs flying across the glass screen with surgical precision. "That still does not explain the seal," I replied. You cannot push a deed through the county portal without a certified notary stamp. How did you fake the jurisdictional seal without triggering an automatic system audit? I held my breath waiting for his response. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, and then appeared again. He was hesitating. I could almost picture him sitting in his failing office debating whether to reveal his illicit methods. But his desperate need to prove his superiority overcame whatever microscopic shred of self-preservation he had left. The next message lit up my screen, illuminating the dark living room. I did not fake it, he bragged. I have a notary in my office who owes me a massive favor. He stamped the deed and logged it in his official journal without asking a single question. $300 and a blind eye. That is all it takes to beat a supposedly brilliant forensic accountant. Tell your mother she can pick up the keys from my office tomorrow morning. I did not type another word. I did not need to. I immediately took high-definition screenshots of the entire conversation. I captured the timestamps, his verified phone number, and every single line of his arrogant confession. I synced the images directly to my secure cloud server, ensuring they could never be deleted or altered by a remote wipe. I opened my encrypted email client and attached the screenshots. I drafted a brief, precise message to Agent Miller, summarizing the contents of the text thread. I also carbon copied the State Real Estate Licensing Board and the State Notary Public Commission. I hit send, watching the progress bar shoot across the screen. The legal net was officially tightening around his neck. The digital evidence alone was enough to strip him of his license and secure a federal indictment for wire fraud and conspiracy. But digital evidence alone was not going to satisfy me. I needed them to cross the point of absolutely no return. I needed them caught red-handed, physically trespassing inside my home, under the delusion of their fraudulent victory. The lead FBI technician approached me, wiping plaster dust from his hands. "We are completely online, Ms. Wilson," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "Every single camera and microphone is active and feeding straight to our secure server in the mobile command unit. We have full coverage of the perimeter, the gate, the driveway, and every interior room on the first floor. All we need now is for your family to actually walk through that front door." I looked around my magnificent home. The sleek, invisible lenses were perfectly hidden in the architecture, silently watching and waiting. My parents and Connor thought they had orchestrated the perfect crime. They believed they were going to march in on Christmas Eve and claim the ultimate prize. They had no idea they were walking directly onto a federal stage. "Let them come," I said, my voice steady and cool. "I will leave the front door unlocked." The FBI technicians packed their equipment and slipped quietly out the back door, leaving my property looking utterly untouched. To any casual observer, my home was a quiet, empty sanctuary, but I knew the reality. Every single square foot of the main floor was now an active federal surveillance zone, broadcasting a crystal-clear encrypted feed directly to Agent Miller and his team. The trap was perfectly set. The spring was wound as tight as it could possibly go. But before the clock ran out and my family arrived to execute their fraudulent eviction, I felt an unexpected pulling sensation in my chest. It was not doubt, and it certainly was not forgiveness. It was the last dying ember of a daughterly obligation. I knew the absolute devastation that was about to rain down on my family. I decided to give my father, Calvin, one final opportunity to walk away from the blast zone. It was a test I fully expected him to fail, but I needed to look him in the eye and offer him the choice. Early the next morning, I drove my Porsche through the sprawling multi-million-dollar campus of my father's megachurch. The sheer scale of the property was a monument to his ego. The massive sanctuary seated thousands of people who blindly trusted their pastor with their spiritual and financial lives. The administrative wing looked like the corporate headquarters of a Fortune 500 company, complete with imported marble floors and soaring glass walls. This empire was built on the tithes of working-class families, but Calvin ruled it like a billionaire tyrant. I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the grand double doors. The administrative assistants at the front desk offered me polite but pitying smiles. They had clearly heard the rumors my parents were spreading about my supposed mental breakdown and financial ruin. I ignored their whispering and walked straight down the executive corridor, pushing open the heavy oak doors to my father's private suite without bothering to knock. Calvin was seated behind a massive desk carved from solid mahogany. He wore a custom-tailored suit and a gold watch that caught the morning light streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows. When he looked up and saw me standing in his doorway, a deeply satisfied smirk spread across his face. He leaned back in his plush leather executive chair and steeped his fingers together. He fully believed I was standing there, broken and defeated, ready to hand over the keys to my estate and beg for his mercy. He did not ask me to sit down, and I did not offer a greeting. I stood firmly in the center of the hand-woven rug and told my father I was giving him exactly one chance to save his own life. I kept my voice incredibly calm and flat. I told Calvin to call Connor immediately. I told him to cancel the fake eviction notice, to tear up the forged quitclaim deed, and to completely abandon their plan to trespass on my property on Christmas Eve. I explained that if he backed away from Connor and his real estate scheme right in this very moment, I would allow him to walk away with his freedom. I offered him a clean break. I stood there offering my own father a lifeline out of the federal snare that was about to snap shut around his ankles. Calvin stared at me for a long moment before letting out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. He shook his head, looking at me with a mixture of profound disappointment and supreme arrogance. He actually thought my warning was the desperate bluff of a cornered woman. "Connor is a respectable white businessman," Calvin stated, his voice dripping with absolute authority and condescension. "He is a provider and a pillar of this community. You, on the other hand, are just a jealous spinster who cannot stand to see her own sister happy and secure. You have always been bitter, Valerie. He is taking the house, and that is final. Do not come into my church making empty threats just because you are too weak to hold on to your own assets." I did not flinch at his cruel words. I did not let the insult register because I knew what I was holding in my briefcase. I unclasped the leather flap and reached inside, pulling out a single crisp sheet of paper. It was a highly sensitive internal bank ledger that Marcus had managed to pull during our deep forensic dive into the shadow accounts. I walked slowly up to the mahogany desk and slid the document across the polished wood. The paper came to rest right on top of my father's open leather-bound Bible. I told Calvin to look very closely at the highlighted transaction on the second line. Calvin frowned in annoyance, but his eyes dropped to the paper. I watched as he read the routing numbers and the transfer details. The document showed a direct wire transfer executed exactly 14 days ago. It was a massive transfer of $500,000. But the money had not come from a private equity firm or a wealthy individual investor. The originating account belonged directly to the church. Specifically, it was the Restricted Charitable Trust, designated exclusively for the church orphanage fund. Connor had not just defrauded his private clients. When his Ponzi scheme began to collapse and the shadow lenders started threatening his life, he had grown desperate for liquid cash. He had used his position as the golden son-in-law to bypass the standard financial protocols, and he had embezzled $500,000 meant for orphans directly into his failing real estate shell company. I watched the color completely drain from my father's face. The smug, arrogant smile vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. His hands began to tremble slightly as he picked up the paper, staring at the undeniable proof that his perfect son-in-law had stolen from the very altar he preached behind. The realization hit Calvin with the force of a physical blow. Connor had robbed the church blind right under his nose and used the stolen charity funds to float a criminal enterprise. For a fraction of a second, I thought Calvin might actually do the right thing. I watched his hand hover over the office telephone. He could have called the police right then and reported the embezzlement to save his congregation. But I saw the exact moment the fear in his eyes curdled into a dark, desperate panic. Calvin had personally vouched for Connor to the entire deacon board. He had given Connor unfettered administrative access to the church finances to boost his business profile. If this massive theft became public knowledge, Calvin would not just lose his prestigious job, he would lose his power, his unblemished reputation, and likely his freedom. He was legally and morally culpable for the missing $500,000. I looked down at my father as he clutched the damning bank statement. He realized the horrifying truth. He was too deeply embedded in the cover-up to stop Connor now. He could not expose the theft without completely destroying himself. The heavy silence in the office was deafening as Calvin realized he was permanently chained to a sinking ship. The morning of December 23rd dawned bitterly cold, with a thick layer of frost clinging to the ancient oak trees lining my driveway. I stood in the center of my meticulously wired living room, zipping up a battered canvas duffel bag. Today was the day of my grand retreat. I pulled on a heavy wool coat and dragged the bag toward the front door, making sure my shoulders were slumped in a posture of utter defeat. I knew I was not alone. Connor was entirely too paranoid to simply trust my word on the phone. I had spotted the unmarked gray sedan parked near the entrance of my private road 2 days ago. It was a cheap private investigator, likely paid from the stolen church orphanage fund, hired to ensure I actually vacated the premises. I dragged 3 more heavy bags out to my car, intentionally dropping one on the frozen gravel to sell my distress. I let out a loud, frustrated sob, burying my face in my hands. I stood there shivering in the biting wind, playing the role of the broken and disowned daughter, to absolute perfection. I loaded the trunk, slammed it shut, and took one final lingering look at the mansion. I manually locked the front door, turning the heavy brass deadbolt with a loud echoing click. I got into my car and drove slowly down the long, winding path. As I passed the wrought iron gates, I deliberately made eye contact with the man sitting inside the gray sedan. I wiped a fake tear from my cheek, turned onto the main highway, and drove away, leaving my $4.5 million estate completely undefended. The moment my car rounded the bend and the gray sedan vanished from my rearview mirror, my entire demeanor shifted. I wiped my face, sat up perfectly straight, and turned up the heating vent. The pathetic performance was over. The trap was armed and the bait had been officially swallowed. I drove 10 miles down the interstate, exiting near the commercial district, and pulling into the underground parking garage of a luxury business hotel. I bypassed the main lobby and took the service elevator directly to the top floor. Agent Miller had secured a massive double suite at the end of the hall. When I pushed open the door, I stepped into a room that looked exactly like a military war room. The luxury king beds had been pushed against the walls to make room for long folding tables covered in laptops, radio equipment, and tangled black cables. Several federal agents wearing headsets were monitoring the live feeds from my house. The 4K resolution cameras broadcasted crystal clear images of my empty living room, the pristine kitchen, and the sweeping front porch. The hidden audio receivers were so incredibly sensitive, I could hear the winter wind howling against my front door. Standing near the main bank of monitors was a familiar face from the local nightly news. Agent Miller had brought in Sarah Jenkins, the most ruthless and respected investigative journalist in the state. She specialized in exposing corrupt politicians and corporate fraud. She had been tracking Connor and his shady real estate firm for months without finding a solid, actionable lead. Now we were handing her the story of the decade wrapped in a digital bow. I walked over to the main table and dropped a thick binder of printed financial evidence right next to her coffee cup. I spent the next hour walking Sarah and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit through the exact mechanics of Connor and his multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I showed them the shell company registrations, the forged notary stamps, and the falsified property deeds he had uploaded to the county registry. But the real shock came when I laid out the internal financial logs from my father and his megachurch. Sarah stared at the paperwork as her jaw practically dropped. I traced the flow of $500,000 moving from the restricted orphanage charity fund directly into Connor and his failing private equity shadow debt. I explained how my father Calvin had deliberately chosen to protect his golden boy son-in-law rather than report the massive theft to the police. My father had sacrificed the most vulnerable members of his own congregation just to maintain his pristine social image and protect his fragile ego. He had sold his soul to help Connor steal my home. The entire hotel room fell completely silent as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal settled over them. It was a sprawling criminal conspiracy orchestrated by a respected broker and actively shielded by a beloved local pastor. Sarah shook her head, staring at the live feed of my empty, silent mansion. She looked at the mountain of federal evidence spread across the folding tables, and then looked back at me. She crossed her arms and asked if I was absolutely sure they would actually break in. She pointed out that Connor had the forged deed, so he could theoretically just wait and go through the county court system to claim the property legally without risking a physical confrontation. I looked at the seasoned journalist and offered a cold, hard smile. I told her that she simply did not understand the psychology of an arrogant, desperate man. Connor did not just want the house for its financial value. He wanted the absolute satisfaction of conquering my territory on his own terms. He wanted my parents to walk through my halls and claim my sanctuary as their own right before Christmas, just to prove to themselves that they had broken me. They were completely addicted to the power trip and the illusion of their own superiority. I told Sarah they would not wait for a judge or a sheriff. They would come today to stake their claim and gloat over their victory. Just as the words left my mouth, the room fell dead silent. A sharp, piercing alarm echoed from the smartphone in my coat pocket. I pulled the device out and stared at the bright red notification flashing across the screen. My home security system application was blaring a perimeter warning. I looked up at Agent Miller and then turned my gaze to the large, high-definition monitors broadcasting the live feed from my estate. The heavy wrought iron front gates, the ones I had locked just hours ago, had just been forcibly breached. On the primary surveillance monitor illuminating the hotel room, the feed switched to the driveway camera. The heavy wrought iron front gates shuddered as a heavy-duty pickup truck forcibly rammed the electronic locking mechanism. The metal groaned and gave way, swinging inward to grant them access. Behind the truck, two pristine luxury SUVs rolled onto the property, crunching over the frost-covered gravel. It was exactly 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. The FBI agents in the room leaned closer to the folding tables, their faces bathed in the glow of the screens. Sarah Jenkins, the investigative reporter, pulled out a digital recorder and held it near the primary audio output speaker. The trap was springing perfectly. The vehicles came to a halt directly in front of the grand sweeping staircase of my dark, silent mansion. The doors of the lead SUV opened, and Connor stepped out into the freezing night air. He was wearing an expensive cashmere overcoat, looking every inch the successful real estate tycoon he pretended to be. He surveyed the property with his hands resting on his hips, his chest puffed out in absolute arrogance. From the passenger side, my sister Monique emerged. She pulled her thick fur collar tightly against her neck, shivering as the biting winter wind whipped across the estate. From the second vehicle, my parents appeared. Calvin adjusted his tailored pastoral suit, while Brenda clutched her designer handbag, staring up at the vaulted roofline of my home with pure, unfiltered greed. They looked like royalty arriving to claim their newly conquered territory. They had no idea they were the main event in a highly coordinated federal sting operation. Connor gestured toward the pickup truck that had rammed the gate. A man in a dark hooded sweatshirt stepped out carrying a heavy canvas tool bag. This was the sketchy locksmith Connor had hired off the books to bypass my commercial-grade smart locks. The man kept his head down, clearly aware that what they were doing was highly illegal. Connor clapped him on the shoulder and pointed toward my massive double front doors. The hidden microphones in the exterior soffits were so incredibly sensitive that the audio feed picked up the crunch of their footsteps on the frozen stone steps. The sound was broadcast with crystal-clear precision into our hotel command center. "Hurry up, Connor!" Monique complained, her high-pitched voice echoing through the federal audio receivers. "I want to pick my bedroom before the kids get sleepy. I cannot believe that loser sister of mine actually bought this." She crossed her arms, tapping her designer boot impatiently against the stone. "It is freezing out here. Just get the door open so we can get the heat running. Brenda walked up the steps behind her daughter, nodding in furious agreement. Your sister always was a selfish hoarder, Brenda stated, her voice dripping with venom. She hid this money from her own family while we struggled. It is only right that Connor is taking over the management of this asset. A black woman simply has no business managing a property of this magnitude without proper male guidance. It is a blessing that we are stepping in to correct her mistakes. Calvin stood next to his wife, raising his hand slightly as if addressing his congregation. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Calvin declared, his deep baritone voice carrying across the empty lawn. He takes from the ungrateful and gives to the righteous. This house is a reward for our faith. In the hotel room, Agent Miller let out a short breath of pure disbelief. He shook his head, staring at the monitor. Sarah Jenkins was furiously taking notes, her eyes wide at the sheer audacity and hypocrisy of my family. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed over my chest, watching my own flesh and blood justify a criminal home invasion using the name of God. I felt no sadness. I felt no heartbreak. I only felt the cold, mechanical precision of a forensic accountant watching the numbers finally add up to a perfect zero. On the screen, the hooded locksmith approached the primary entry panel. I had told Agent Miller I would leave the door unlocked, but I had specifically left the electronic strike plate engaged. I wanted Connor to physically execute a forced entry. The locksmith pulled a digital decryption pad from his bag and wired it into my smart lock housing. He typed furiously on a small keyboard, completely oblivious to the 4K resolution camera concealed directly above his head in the porch lighting fixture. The camera was so sharp we could literally read the code he was inputting. It took him less than 2 minutes to bypass the system. A loud, heavy click resonated across the porch as the electronic strike plate disengaged. The locksmith immediately unhooked his equipment, shoved the wires back into his bag, and took a large step backward. He did not want to be anywhere near the door when it actually opened. Connor pulled a thick stack of cash from his overcoat pocket and handed it to the man. The locksmith snatched the money, turned on his heel, and practically sprinted back to his truck. He threw it into gear and sped down the driveway, eager to put distance between himself and the felony he had just facilitated. Connor did not even watch him leave. He turned his attention back to the massive wooden doors. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a folded document. It was the forged lease agreement, the fake legal paperwork he had manufactured to justify this entire hostile takeover. He gripped the document in his left hand, brandishing it like a royal decree or a shield against any consequences. He truly believed that piece of paper made him invincible. He believed his connections and his bribery had rendered him untouchable. He stepped up to the threshold and grabbed the heavy brass handles. With a dramatic flourish, he pushed the massive double doors wide open. The pitch-black foyer of my mansion yawned before them like the mouth of a dark cavern. The complete silence of the empty house spilled out onto the porch. Connor turned back to look at my parents and his wife. He stood directly in the center of the doorway, framed by the darkness behind him. He puffed out his chest, holding up the forged document for them to see. A wide, triumphant smile stretched across his face as he prepared to deliver his victory speech. "Welcome to our new home, family," Connor announced, his voice ringing with absolute arrogance. He turned his back to the cold night air and stepped confidently across the threshold straight into the pitch-black foyer. Connor took another arrogant step into the darkness of my foyer, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the imported marble floor. He let out a low whistle of appreciation, letting the sheer scale of the entryway wash over him. Monique pushed past him, complaining about the freezing wind and shivering in her designer fur coat. She demanded that he find the light switch immediately so she could start mentally measuring the living room for her new furniture. Brenda and Calvin followed closely behind them, pulling the heavy double doors shut and plunging the entryway into near-total darkness. They were a pack of scavengers standing in the belly of my home, entirely convinced they had won the war. Connor ran his hand along the smooth plaster of the wall, searching blindly for the smart home control panel. I could hear his shallow, excited breathing through the hidden microphones broadcasting directly to the earpieces of the federal agent standing right beside me. He found the sleek glass face of the control pad and tapped the screen with a confident strike of his index finger. He expected the warm, inviting glow of my ambient chandelier lighting to welcome him to his stolen kingdom. He expected the quiet hum of the central heating system to chase away the bitter winter chill and comfort his shivering wife. Instead, he triggered the manual override protocol I had programmed specifically for this exact moment. The response was instantaneous and absolutely blinding. Every single high-intensity security floodlight in the massive open-concept living area ignited simultaneously with a loud electronic crack. The brilliant white glare struck them with the force of a physical blow. Connor threw his hands up to shield his face, stumbling backward and knocking directly into Monique. She let out a sharp cry of surprise as her designer heels slipped on the polished marble. Brenda let out a startled shriek, dropping her expensive handbag onto the floor with a loud clatter that echoed off the walls. The sudden, overwhelming illumination completely stripped away the comforting shadows, leaving them entirely exposed in the center of my foyer like terrified animals caught in the headlights of an oncoming train. Calvin, always desperate to maintain absolute control of any situation, instantly puffed out his chest and tried to assert his dominance over the unexpected technological malfunction. He squinted through the harsh glare, fully assuming I was cowering at the top of the grand staircase, playing petty games with the smart home application from my smartphone. He stepped in front of Connor, trying to shield his golden boy, and pointed a thick, angry finger toward the second-floor landing. "Valerie!" he bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with the practiced boom of a Sunday morning sermon. "Do not make this difficult. We have the court order right here. You are legally evicted. Show yourself immediately and hand over the security codes before I call the local authorities to drag you out of here in handcuffs." He waved the forged lease agreement in the air, treating the fake document like an impenetrable shield. He actually thought he was the one summoning the law to do his bidding. He actually believed his righteous anger would force me into submission one final time. He stood there demanding my surrender while holding the exact piece of evidence that would send him to federal prison. As their pupils finally began to adjust to the blinding intensity of the floodlights, the hazy silhouettes in front of them started to sharpen into crystal clear focus. The confident sneer on Connor's face slowly melted away, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. The self-righteous fury in Calvin's posture instantly evaporated, leaving him looking like a deflated and broken old man. Monique and Brenda stopped complaining about the cold and froze completely solid like statues carved from pure terror. They were not looking at an empty house. They were not looking at a defeated daughter cowering on the stairs. I was standing directly in the center of my massive living room, perfectly framed by the towering stone fireplace. I wore a tailored crimson suit and a calm, relaxed smile. I held a crystal flute of sparkling apple cider in my right hand, taking a slow, deliberate sip as I watched the horrifying reality of their situation crash over them. The cider was crisp and cold, and it tasted exactly like victory. I did not look terrified or broken. I looked like a woman who was exactly where she belonged, hosting a very exclusive holiday gathering. But it was not my presence that drained the blood from their faces. It was the heavily armed welcoming committee standing shoulder to shoulder, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of federal authority right inside my living room. Flanking me to my left were 6 FBI agents clad in dark tactical gear, their windbreakers boldly emblazoned with the unmistakable yellow letters of the Bureau. Agent Miller stood at the front of the formation, his arms crossed over his chest, and his eyes locked directly onto Connor. He did not look like a man who was here to negotiate a civil property dispute. He looked like a predator who had just cornered his prey. The agents stood in perfect silence, their expressions hard and uncompromising. To my right stood 2 local county police officers, the very same jurisdiction Calvin had just threatened to call. They had their hands resting casually on their duty belts, their expressions hard and unforgiving, as they stared down at the forged federal document still clutched tightly in my father's trembling fist. They were the physical embodiment of the trap snapping shut, the undeniable proof that my family's local influence meant absolutely nothing in the face of a federal sting operation. And standing directly behind me, capturing every single micro-expression of their utter devastation, was Sarah Jenkins and her investigative news crew. The heavy broadcast camera was hoisted onto the shoulder of a towering cameraman who kept the lens pointed directly at Connor's panicked face. The bright red recording light glowed like a beacon in the brightly lit room, confirming that every single second was being recorded. A boom microphone hovered just out of frame, capturing the terrified gasps escaping from my mother's throat and the heavy, ragged breathing of my father. Sarah stood with a sleek microphone in hand, watching the architects of a massive real estate and church embezzlement conspiracy realize they had just broken into a fully monitored crime scene. They were not just caught. They were caught on a live, uninterrupted feed broadcasting their home invasion, their forged documents, and their unhinged arrogance straight to a secure federal server and an investigative news desk. The red carpet had been rolled out, the stage was perfectly set, and my family had just delivered the performance of a lifetime. Connor stood completely frozen in the center of the brilliant illumination, the forged lease agreement still clutched tightly in his left hand. The utter silence in the massive foyer was absolute, broken only by the soft mechanical whir of Sarah Jenkins zooming her camera lens directly onto his terrified face. For a fraction of a second, I saw the undeniable reality of the situation penetrate his thick skull. But Connor had spent his entire life failing upward, heavily shielded by his wealth, his connections, and his inherent privilege. He simply could not compute the idea that he was finally facing a solid wall he could not buy or charm his way out of. The initial shock rapidly morphed into a defensive mask of indignant fury. He puffed out his chest, completely ignoring the federal agents flanking me, and turned his attention directly to the two local county police officers. He recognized their uniforms, and his deeply ingrained entitlement immediately assumed they were there to enforce his manufactured authority. Officers, Connor barked, his voice dripping with the arrogant condescension of a man used to giving orders to blue-collar workers. "I want this woman arrested immediately. She is trespassing on my private estate. I am the legal owner of this property, and here is the deed to prove it." He thrust the forged document forward, shaking it at the local cops as if it were a magic wand. He actually expected them to step past the FBI, walk up to me, and put me in handcuffs right there in my own living room. The sheer delusion was staggering. The two local officers did not even blink. They remained perfectly still, their hands resting casually on their duty belts, looking at Connor with expressions of supreme disgust. Agent Miller stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my brother-in-law. The federal agent did not even glance at the piece of paper Connor was desperately waving. "We know exactly what that document is," Mr. Webb. Agent Miller stated, his voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "We watched you forge the notary's signature in real time. We tracked the digital upload directly to the county registry via your personal IP address at your downtown office. Committing forgery to steal real estate is a federal offense." Connor lowered his arm as the blood completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. "Forging a property deed is a serious felony," Agent Miller continued, taking another slow, intimidating step forward. "But it is honestly the least of your problems tonight. We also have the unredacted digital logs showing the unauthorized transfer of $500,000 from the Church Orphanage Trust directly into your failing private equity shell company." I watched my sister Monique physically recoil as if she had been struck across the face. Her eyes darted wildly between her husband and the federal agents. The grand illusion of her perfect, wealthy lifestyle shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the rolling news cameras. She realized in that exact agonizing moment that her designer clothes, her luxury SUVs, and her arrogant superiority were all funded by money stolen from vulnerable orphans. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a strangled, pathetic gasp escaped her throat. My father Calvin immediately went into survival mode. The man who had just cited divine providence to justify stealing my home now desperately tried to save his own skin. He took a wide, frantic step away from Connor, physically distancing himself from the blast zone. "I had absolutely no knowledge of this," Calvin stammered, his booming pastoral voice reduced to a cowardly squeak. I trusted this man. He deceived our family. He deceived the entire church. I took a slow sip of my sparkling cider and looked my father dead in the eye. Do not bother lying, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly through the massive foyer. We have the audio recordings of your private phone calls with Connor. We know you personally authorized the override of the church security protocols to give him access to those restricted accounts. You helped him drain that charity fund to cover his debts, and you fully intended to use the theft of my house to replace the missing church funds before the annual audit. My mother, Brenda, let out a loud, dramatic wail and slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor in a heap of expensive winter fabric and shattered pride. For once, her tears were entirely genuine. She was not mourning the destruction of her family. She was mourning the permanent destruction of her pristine social status. The entire city was going to watch her husband and her golden son-in-law get hauled away in federal custody on the evening news. Connor looked wildly around the brightly lit room. The local police blocked the hallway to his left. The FBI agents formed a solid, impenetrable wall in front of me. The bright security floodlights illuminated every single bead of sweat rolling down his forehead. He looked down at the forged deed in his hand, realizing it was the physical proof of his own demise. He dropped the paper onto the marble floor as if it had suddenly caught fire. The fight or flight instinct kicked in, completely overriding whatever tiny fraction of rational thought he had left in his panicked brain. He let out a desperate, animalistic shout, spun on his heel, and sprinted toward the open front doors. He was actually trying to outrun a fully coordinated federal raid. He did not even make it 3 steps. The 2 FBI agents stationed near the entryway moved with terrifying tactical speed. They lunged forward, closing the gap in a fraction of a second. The lead agent hit Connor square in the back, wrapping his thick arms around his waist and driving him straight into the polished marble floor. The impact echoed through the foyer with a sickening thud. Connor screamed in shock as the second agent dropped a heavy knee squarely between his shoulder blades, pinning him flat against the cold stone. The sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists provided the perfect, satisfying soundtrack for the rolling television cameras, capturing every single second of his absolute ruin. The heavy metallic click of the handcuffs securing Connor to the marble floor acted like a starter pistol for my sister. The sheer shock that had kept Monique frozen in place abruptly shattered. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream that forced the audio technician holding the boom microphone to physically wince and step back. Monique stared at her husband groveling on the ground with the federal agent pressing a knee into his cashmere coat, and then she whipped her head toward our parents. She shrieked at my father, demanding that he use his influence to stop this madness. She ordered him to call the mayor, the police chief, or anyone else in his congregation to fix the nightmare unfolding in my foyer. But Calvin simply stood there, paralyzed with fear, completely powerless in the face of federal authority. When she realized no one was coming to her rescue, her sheer panic instantly violently curdled into blind rage. She locked her furious gaze onto me, standing calmly by the fireplace with my sparkling cider. The veins in her neck bulged as she lunged forward. She raised her hand, aiming a desperate, vicious slap directly at my face. She wanted to physically punish me for tearing down her perfect, wealthy facade. She never even came close to making contact. The female county police officer who had been standing to my right moved with blinding speed. She intercepted Monique mid-stride, grabbing my sister by the wrist and twisting her arm sharply behind her back. The officer shoved Monique hard against the textured stone of the fireplace, pinning her securely in place. Monique thrashed against the stone, completely losing her mind. She screamed that I had orchestrated this entire setup just to destroy her. She yelled to the news cameras that I was nothing but a jealous, bitter woman who could not stand the fact that she had secured a wealthy husband and a beautiful marriage while I had absolutely nothing. She called me a vindictive spinster who was trying to steal her happiness because I could not find my own. Her voice echoed through the grand room, echoing with a lifetime of deeply ingrained superiority. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the anger she was desperately trying to provoke. I looked my sister directly in the eyes and watched the remaining defiance drain out of her. I told Monique that her entire marriage was a pathetic financial fraud. I kept my tone incredibly flat, explaining that her perfect provider of a husband was completely bankrupt and currently facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and embezzlement. I watched her perfectly manicured facade crack as I laid out the reality of her situation. She had spent years looking down on me, flaunting her expensive cars and her lavish vacations, completely unaware that they were entirely funded by stolen charity money. But I was not finished. I leaned in slightly closer and delivered the final crushing blow. I reminded Monique about the stack of mortgage documents Connor had asked her to sign last month. I explained that Connor had needed a co-signer for his fraudulent shell company to bypass the internal bank security protocols. I watched the color completely drain from her face as the realization hit her. Monique had blindly signed her name to dozens of falsified federal loan applications just because Connor told her it would help secure a new vacation home. She was not just a clueless wife enjoying the spoils of his crimes. She had put her own signature on the digital trail of a multi-million-dollar federal felony. Agent Miller stepped away from Connor, leaving the other agents to haul him up from the floor. He walked over to where the female police officer was pinning Monique against the fireplace. He did not look at her with an ounce of sympathy. He looked at her the exact same way he looked at her husband. Agent Miller stated in a loud, clear voice that her signature on those documents made her a willing participant in the embezzlement scheme. He looked directly into her terrified eyes and informed her that she was officially under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The female officer did not hesitate. She pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from her duty belt and snapped them violently around Monique's wrists, securing her arms behind her back. Monique began to sob uncontrollably, her knees buckling as the officers held her up right in front of the rolling television cameras. Calvin and Brenda stood trapped in the center of my foyer, completely surrounded by federal agents watching in absolute sheer horror as their golden child and her perfect husband were simultaneously shackled and read their Miranda rights. As Monique collapsed into a weeping mess of ruined entitlement, my father realized he was the absolute last man standing. The grand patriarch of the Jackson family was cornered, and his instinct for self-preservation kicked into high gear. He took another large step away from his handcuffed daughter, entirely abandoning her to the federal agents. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket and stood as tall as he possibly could, trying to summon the righteous authority of his church position. He looked directly at the local police officers and then at the glaring lens of the news camera. "I am Deacon Calvin Jackson," he bellowed, his voice trembling, but desperate to command respect. "We are victims here. This entire family has been completely deceived. Connor tricked us. We had absolutely no idea what he was doing behind closed doors. We are innocent God-fearing people who have been manipulated by a con artist. He was actually trying to sacrifice his golden boy to save his own reputation." He stood there in my foyer, wrapping himself in the holy shield of his deacon title, entirely ready to throw his favorite son-in-law straight to the wolves. But Sarah Jenkins was not a local congregation member easily swayed by his booming sermons. The investigative reporter saw the exact moment the arrogant patriarch tried to pivot into a victim, and she pounced. She stepped right out from behind the wall of federal agents and thrust her sleek black microphone directly into my father's sweating face. "Deacon Jackson." Sarah said, her voice razor-sharp and projecting clearly for the evening broadcast. "Is it true that you personally authorized the transfer of $500,000 from the church orphanage fund? Is it true you deliberately bypassed the Financial Oversight Committee to help Connor Webb cover his massive private equity debts?" The question hit the room like a physical shockwave. Brenda let out another horrifying gasp, pressing both hands over her mouth. Calvin stood completely paralyzed. The holy shield he had wrapped himself in evaporated instantly, leaving him completely exposed. He stared at the glowing red recording light on the broadcast camera. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the FBI agents. He realized there was no charming his way out of a digital paper trail and a live television interview, so he resorted to the absolute oldest trick in his manipulative playbook. Calvin let out a sudden ragged gasp and reached his right hand up to claw at his chest. His face contorted into a mask of sudden extreme agony. He staggered backward, bumping into the marble wall, and slowly slid down to his knees. "Oh, Lord," he wheezed, clutching his tailored shirt. "My heart. The stress is too much. I need a doctor." Brenda immediately started screaming for someone to call an ambulance, throwing herself onto the floor beside him and crying about his delicate blood pressure. Calvin squeezed his eyes shut and began taking shallow, dramatic breaths, performing a medical emergency with the desperate theatricality of a cornered coward. He honestly thought a health crisis would force the cameras to cut away and make the federal agents treat him with gentle sympathy. He clearly did not realize just how thoroughly I had prepared for every single one of his predictable reactions. Agent Miller did not even blink at the dramatic display on the floor. He simply reached up to his shoulder radio and calmly requested the medical standby unit to enter the premises. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy double doors swung open, and two uniformed paramedics rushed into the foyer, carrying heavy medical bags and a portable cardiac monitor. They had been parked at the bottom of my driveway for the last hour, explicitly briefed on the possibility of a high-stress medical event during the raid. The paramedics knelt beside my father, ignoring Brenda's hysterical wailing. They quickly and efficiently attached sensors to his chest and wrist. Calvin kept his eyes squeezed shut, groaning softly and playing the part of a dying man to absolute perfection. He waited for the frantic beeping of the machines and the urgent shouts of the medical professionals to validate his performance and halt the arrests. Instead, the lead paramedic looked down at the digital monitor and then looked directly up at Agent Miller. The paramedic let out a heavy sigh of annoyance. "His vitals are perfectly fine," the paramedic announced, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room and straight into the news microphone. "His heart rate is slightly elevated from stress, but his blood pressure and oxygen levels are absolutely normal. He is not having a heart attack. He is completely faking it." The total silence that followed that medical declaration was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Calvin's eyes snapped open in sheer shock. The groaning immediately stopped. He looked up from the marble floor, staring directly into the lens of the news camera that was broadcasting his fake medical emergency to the entire city. The absolute humiliation washing over his face was profound. He had tried to use his church status to claim victimhood, and when that failed, he had tried to fake a heart attack to avoid accountability. And he had just been exposed as a pathetic, desperate liar on a live, uninterrupted television feed. The lead paramedic snapped his heavy medical kit shut with a sharp, definitive click that echoed like a gavel striking a wooden sound block. He stood up, brushing past my father, who was still kneeling on the marble floor, completely frozen in his exposed lie. Calvin kept his eyes locked on the recording lens of the news camera, watching his own fabricated martyrdom broadcast live to his entire congregation and the entire city. There was no medical emergency. There was no divine intervention. There was only a pathetic, desperate man caught in the blinding spotlight of his own overwhelming greed. Brenda watched the paramedic walk away, and the absolute finality of the situation finally crashed through her thick wall of denial. Her husband was a publicly disgraced fraud. Her golden son-in-law was a handcuffed felon groveling in the dirt. Her perfect, flawless daughter was pinned against my stone fireplace with her hands securely fastened behind her back, weeping hysterically as a federal agent coldly read her Miranda rights. The pristine high society life my mother had spent decades ruthlessly constructing was burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by Monique sobbing, and the quiet mechanical whir of the broadcast camera capturing every angle of their downfall. Brenda looked around the massive foyer, her eyes darting frantically from the impassive local police officers to the stone-faced federal agents. She realized in that agonizing second that her country club charm and her fake church smiles were completely useless. She had absolutely no leverage left to play. She had no power. She had nothing. Brenda let out a guttural, agonizing wail that tore from the very bottom of her throat. Her knees buckled beneath the heavy weight of her designer fur coat, and she collapsed onto the cold, polished marble. She did not fall with her usual practiced grace. She dropped like a stone, abandoning every single ounce of dignity she had ever claimed to possess. Her expensive leather handbag spilled open, scattering her perfect high-end cosmetics across the floor. She did not try to stand back up. Instead, she pushed herself forward onto her hands and knees. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, criticizing my clothes, my career, and my very existence, was now physically crawling across my foyer. The heavy fur of her coat dragged across the stone, sweeping through the spilled makeup as she scrambled desperately toward my feet. "Valerie!" she cried, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "Valerie, please! You have to stop this! You have to make them stop!" She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the hem of my tailored crimson trousers. Her perfect manicure dug into the fabric as she tilted her tear-streaked face up toward mine. "Valerie, please, Brenda," sobbed, her makeup running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. "We are your parents. We gave you life. You cannot do this to your own family. Tell them to let your sister go. Tell them this is all a huge misunderstanding." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had birthed me. I felt the desperate grip of her fingers on my suit pants. I heard the hysterical pleading in her voice. And I felt absolutely nothing. There was no anger left in my chest. There was no lingering childhood desire for her approval or her warmth. There was only a profound, freezing emptiness. She was not crying because she realized she had wronged me. She was crying because she had finally been caught, and she wanted me to throw myself in front of a moving train to save her favorite child. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled her trembling fingers off my clothing. I stepped back, creating a physical distance between us that perfectly mirrored the massive emotional chasm she had spent 30 years digging. "You do not get to invoke the title of parent tonight, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a low, icy whisper that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "You lost that right a long time ago. You forgot me every single Christmas while you showered Monique and Connor with lavish gifts bought with stolen money. You happily sat at holiday dinners and mocked my independence while you praised a man who was actively draining an orphanage fund." Brenda shook her head wildly, reaching out for me again, but I took another deliberate step back. "You did not come here tonight to be a mother," I continued, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "You came here to steal my home and throw me out into the freezing winter wind because your golden son-in-law told you to. You traded your own flesh and blood for a con artist because he drove a fancy car and threw fake charity galas. You traded me for a son-in-law who robbed you absolutely blind." Brenda let out another agonizing sob, pressing her face against the cold floor. "Please, Valerie," she begged, her voice muffled against the marble. "Please do not do this to your sister." I looked past her to where Monique was being hauled toward the front doors by the female police officer. I looked at Calvin, who was still kneeling in silent shock, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Then I looked back down at the broken, weeping woman at my feet. "You do not have a daughter named Valerie anymore," I said. I did not wait for her response. I turned my back on the pathetic scene unfolding in my entryway. I walked deliberately toward the grand, sweeping staircase that dominated the center of the house. I placed my hand on the smooth mahogany railing and began to ascend the steps. I did not look back. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who had just reclaimed her entire life. I could hear the FBI agents ordering Connor to his feet. I could hear Monique screaming my name as they dragged her out the front doors. I could hear Brenda sobbing hysterically on the floor. But the higher I climbed, the fainter their voices became, until they were nothing more than background noise fading away into the absolute perfection of my victory. The silence that settled over my home that night was a beautiful, heavy thing. 3 months later, that exact same heavy silence hung in the air of the federal courthouse in downtown Boston. I sat in the polished wooden pew of the gallery, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. My posture was perfect. My breathing was steady. Directly in front of me, sitting at the defense table, were the hollowed-out remains of my sister and her golden husband. Connor looked absolutely unrecognizable. The expensive tailored suits and the arrogant sneer were completely gone, replaced by the drab, shapeless fabric of a standard-issue prison uniform. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was thinning. He looked like a broken man who had finally collided with the concrete wall of reality. Monique sat next to him, shivering slightly in the cold air-conditioned room. She was not wearing her designer furs or her imported diamonds. She looked pale and entirely stripped of the unearned confidence that had fueled her entire existence. They were waiting for the Honorable Judge Harrison to deliver the final blow. The trial had been swift and utterly merciless. The digital paper trail Agent Miller and his team had compiled was an airtight vault of undeniable evidence. Connor had not just embezzled church funds. He had systematically attempted to defraud a federal bank while orchestrating a highly coordinated theft of my personal assets. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down from his elevated bench. His expression was a mask of supreme judicial disgust. He did not mince words. He stated clearly for the official court record that Connor had operated with a deeply malicious and predatory arrogance. He noted that Connor had deliberately targeted a highly successful African-American female professional operating under the deeply racist and privileged delusion that my hard-earned wealth was somehow illegitimate and inherently ripe for the taking. He called Connor a parasite who hid behind his country club pedigree and his religious connections to exploit vulnerable orphans and terrorize his own extended family. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom. Connor Webb was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He flinched violently as if the judge had physically struck him. He buried his face in his trembling hands, but there was no one left to bail him out. The judge then turned his piercing gaze to Monique. He noted her willing participation, her signature on the fraudulent documents, and her active role in the conspiracy to steal my home. She wept openly, begging for leniency, citing her status as a mother and a respectable member of society. The judge was completely unmoved by her theatrical tears. He sentenced my sister to 3 years in federal prison for complicity in wire fraud. 2 federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grasping Monique by the arms and leading her away. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her eyes wide with sheer terror, but I offered her nothing but a blank, uncompromising stare. The collapse of their fraudulent kingdom had created a massive blast radius that instantly incinerated my parents. I walked out of the federal courthouse breathing in the crisp spring air, knowing exactly what the defense of their golden child had cost Calvin and Brenda. When the federal indictments were handed down, my parents had desperately tried to maintain their illusion of wealth and control. They had liquidated their entire retirement portfolio and taken out massive predatory loans to hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the city for Monique and Connor. They truly believed that throwing enough money at the problem would magically make the federal charges disappear. Instead, it left them completely destitute. The bank foreclosed on their pristine suburban mansion just 4 weeks into the trial. The local news had broadcasted the moving trucks, hauling away their expensive antique furniture to be sold at auction. But the financial ruin was only the beginning of Calvin's ultimate downfall. The full extent of his involvement in Connor's church embezzlement scheme had been thoroughly exposed during the financial audits. The congregation that had once hung on his every word turned on him with righteous fury. The church elders did not just ask him to step down. They publicly stripped him of his deacon title and formally excommunicated him from the congregation, banning him from ever setting foot on the church property again. The man who had used his religious authority as a weapon to control his family was cast out and permanently shunned by his own community. I returned to my quiet, secure home, the very same house they had tried to steal from me. The evening sun cast a warm golden light across the marble floor of my foyer. I walked over to the antique console table near the front door where my assistant had left the day's mail. Sitting right on top of the neat stack of corporate documents was a cheap, crumpled envelope with no return address. The handwriting was jagged and frantic, but I recognized my mother's slanted script immediately. I picked it up, feeling the thin, coarse paper between my fingers. They were no longer living in their comfortable, gated community. They were currently staying in a run-down weekly motel on the outskirts of the city, living out of garbage bags and relying on food pantries just to survive. I slowly tore open the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of lined notebook paper. It was a final, desperate letter from Brenda and Calvin. It was completely devoid of their usual demands or their self-righteous arrogance. The letter was a pathetic, rambling plea for mercy. Brenda wrote that they had absolutely nothing left. She said that Calvin's health was failing and that they could not afford his heart medication. She begged me to remember that they were my parents, to look past the mistakes they had made, and to please send them money to secure a small apartment. She wrote that I was their last and only hope in the world. I stood perfectly still in the center of my beautiful home, reading the desperate words of the people who had tried to destroy me. I stood perfectly still in the center of my beautiful foyer, reading the desperate words of the people who had tried to destroy me. The cheap lined paper trembled slightly in my hands as I absorbed the sheer breathtaking audacity of their request. Calvin and Brenda were begging for salvation. They wanted me to open my checkbook, to play the dutiful, obedient daughter one last time, and to rescue them from the squalid motel room they now called home. They did not apologize for treating me like a second-class citizen for 30 years. They did not apologize for standing by and cheering while Monique tried to steal my house. They only apologized because their bank accounts were empty and their high society friends had completely abandoned them. I did not shed a single tear. I did not pick up my phone to call them. I did not write a check. Instead, I turned around and walked calmly down the hall to my private home office. I walked straight over to the heavy-duty paper shredder sitting beside my mahogany desk. I switched the machine on and fed the pathetic letter directly into the metal teeth. The loud mechanical grinding sound echoed through the quiet room. I watched the handwritten words begging for family loyalty get sliced into 1,000 tiny, unrecognizable ribbons of garbage. I emptied the shredder bin straight into the trash and thoroughly washed my hands. That was the absolute last time I ever thought about Calvin and Brenda Jackson. Fast forward exactly 1 year. The bitter, freezing winter had returned to Boston, but the atmosphere inside my home could not have been more different. It was Christmas Eve, and my grand suburban mansion was brilliantly illuminated with thousands of warm golden lights. The scent of fresh pine, expensive catering, and cinnamon drifted through the massive hallways. I was not hiding in the corner, avoiding cruel jabs from my sister. I was not biting my tongue while my father praised a criminal. I was standing in the center of my grand living room wearing a stunning emerald green evening gown, hosting the most magnificent holiday gala of the entire year. I looked around the crowded room and smiled. I had not invited a single blood relative to my home. Instead, I had filled my house with my chosen family. My brilliant corporate colleagues, who had stood by my side during the darkest days of the scandal, were laughing around the blazing stone fireplace. My closest friends, who knew my true worth, were gathered around the grand piano singing festive songs with drinks in their hands. And most importantly, sitting at the head of my enormous dining table were the elderly charity directors and private investors I had personally shielded from Connor's predatory fraud. I had spent the last year working tirelessly to ensure that not a single one of his intended victims lost their life savings. They raised their crystal glasses to me from across the room, their eyes filled with genuine, profound gratitude. This was what real love looked like. It was not based on manipulation or toxic obedience. It was built on mutual respect, integrity, and shared triumph. The party was in full swing, a beautiful symphony of joy and warmth. I excused myself for a brief moment, wanting to take it all in. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and opened the heavy French doors leading out to my private stone balcony. The crisp, freezing December air hit my face, but I did not feel cold. I felt incredibly alive. I looked out over the sprawling, snow-covered acres of my estate. The property was safe. My wealth was secure. My business had absolutely skyrocketed over the last 12 months. Once the toxic weight of my family had been completely severed from my life, my career had reached unimaginable new heights. I had recently been named the top financial executive in the state, and my firm was currently opening 3 new international branches. I no longer had to constantly look over my shoulder or defend my success to people who secretly wanted me to fail. As I stood there admiring the peaceful winter landscape, my phone buzzed softly inside my velvet clutch. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an automated legal and news alert from my attorney. The notification was brief, but it carried the weight of absolute beautiful finality. The Federal Financial Oversight Board had officially and permanently revoked Connor Webb's brokerage license. He was barred for life from ever working in the financial sector again. It was a cast-iron guarantee that even when he eventually left federal prison as a broken old man, he would never be legally permitted to touch another portfolio. The second notification was an official update from the bankruptcy courts. Monique Webb had officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy from inside her federal prison cell. She had zero assets, zero income, and millions of dollars in court-ordered restitution debt that she could never possibly repay. Her fake luxury lifestyle was permanently and completely eradicated. When she finally got out, she would be starting from absolute zero with a felony record permanently attached to her name. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse. I listened to the sounds of genuine laughter and clinking crystal floating up from the massive party happening in my living room below. I thought about Monique sitting in a freezing concrete cell eating holiday food off a plastic tray. I thought about Connor stripped of his arrogant pride and facing a decade and a half of confinement. I thought about Calvin and Brenda shivering in a rundown motel, completely forgotten by the polite society they had worshipped above their own daughter. They had tried to break me. They had tried to take everything I had built with my own 2 hands. But their bottomless greed had been their ultimate undoing. They had dug their own graves and buried themselves in the dirt. I stood completely alone on the balcony under the bright, twinkling winter stars. I held my expensive crystal flute filled with vintage champagne. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I raised my glass to the dark, quiet sky, offering a silent toast to my own unwavering resilience. I took a slow, satisfying sip of the cold champagne, letting the crisp sweetness wash over me. I had finally received the ultimate perfect Christmas gift. I had total, absolute, uninterrupted peace. The greatest lesson to take away from this story is that shared blood does not automatically equal a true family. For years, Valerie sought the validation of parents who only viewed her as a lesser shadow compared to her golden sister. She endured constant emotional neglect and manipulation. Her ultimate triumph was finally realizing that true security comes from within and from the chosen family we actively build around us. You are never obligated to tolerate toxic behavior or financial exploitation just because people call themselves your parents. You must protect your peace, build firm boundaries, and bravely walk away from anyone who refuses to respect your inherent value and worth. Please share your own experiences with setting boundaries in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering stories.